The pink slip of paper was taped to my front door at eye level. It smelled like cheap adhesive and damp paper. A 30-day notice to quit. An eviction notice for the house I grew up in, the house my father built. But the most jarring part was not the threat of losing my home. It was the signature at the bottom of the property transfer attached to the back. It was my signature, my own ink, my own handwriting, used as the weapon to destroy me. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where quiet observation always defeats loud manipulation. If stories about unmasking family betrayal and serving cold, calculated justice are your kind of thing, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and make sure to subscribe so the next story finds you. To understand how my own mother and sister-in-law legally stole a $450,000 house, you have to rewind 2 weeks. Tuesday, late October. The digital clock on my microwave read 1:14 a.m. In the New Jersey suburbs, a doorbell ringing past midnight only means one thing: tragedy. I stood in my foyer in a fleece robe, unlatching the deadbolt. The amber porch light hit my mother Barbara first. Her hands covered her mouth and her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. Next to her stood my sister-in-law Jessica. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks. They pushed past me into the house, bringing the sharp smell of autumn rain and panic with them. "Jason is in jail," Barbara gasped. She clutched her leather purse to her chest like a shield, her fingernails dug into the strap. "A terrible misunderstanding, Emily. A felony charge." She could barely get the words out between sobs. "I am a data analyst for a logistics firm. I deal in spreadsheets, predictability, and risk assessment. I do not deal in midnight bail bonds." But seeing my mother tremble altered the math in my head. "Bail is $250,000, Jessica said. Her voice was thick, slick with tears. "The bondsman needs collateral. Tonight. Right now. If we do not secure it, they are transferring him to county lockup. He will not survive county, Emily. You know him." The fear in their eyes was convincing. It bypassed my logic and targeted the softest part of my loyalty. Jessica reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a blue cardboard folder. She dropped a stack of papers on my kitchen island. The thud echoed in the quiet room. "It is just a temporary hold for the bondsman," she promised. "Just to show the court we have liquid assets. We tear it up the minute the judge reviews it tomorrow." I looked at my mother. Her eyes pleaded with me. I reached into my pocket for the vintage Mont Blanc pen my late father gave me for college graduation. I did not know it yet, but my brother was not sitting in a jail cell that night, and I was about to sign away the only thing my father ever left me. My father was a man who trusted concrete things. He trusted wood. He trusted steel. He trusted the finality of ink on a page. When he handed me a vintage Mont Blanc pen on the afternoon of my college graduation, he did not offer a grand speech about changing the world. He offered a rule for survival. He told me to never let the nib of the pen touch the bottom of a page until the cap had traced the top. You read the header. You identify the nature of the document. You ground yourself in the verifiable facts before you commit your name to the line. It was a grounding technique designed to separate emotion from legal reality. Standing in my kitchen at 1 a.m, I pulled that exact pen from the pocket of my robe. The black resin felt cool and familiar against my palm. I reached toward the blue cardboard folder sitting on my granite island. I intended to follow my father's rule. I intended to slide the cap across the top margin of the paperwork. But as my arm moved forward, my mother lunged. Barbara did not reach for my hand to seek comfort. She gripped my wrist. Her fingers clamped down with a terrifying, unyielding strength. Her nails pressed sharp half-moons into my skin. "Please, Emily," she sobbed. Her voice pitched into a ragged, hysterical frequency. "Every single minute counts. If we delay, they put him on the transport bus." The human brain is poorly equipped to handle sudden, intense emotional crossfire. The logic centers shut down, and the survival instincts take over. I looked at my mother. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror. She anchored my arm, rendering my father's grounding technique impossible. Jessica stood on the other side of the island. She worked as a senior loan processor for a regional mortgage firm. She handled hundreds of closing packets a month. She possessed a terrifying fluency with paperwork. She did not hand me the stack of documents. She maintained physical control of the paper at all times. She laid the folder flat on the counter and peeled the pages back from the bottom right corner. She lifted them just high enough to expose the blank signature lines waiting for my ink. The top sheet was visible. I saw a bold black logo belonging to a local bail bond agency. I saw the words "Temporary Collateral Agreement" printed in a sterile serif font. I saw my brother's full legal name, Jason Thomas Woods. What I did not see was the sleight of hand occurring beneath that top page. Jessica had arranged a masterclass in misdirection. Tucked seamlessly beneath the legitimate bail paperwork was a completely different document, a binding, unalterable quitclaim deed. When she folded the top pages upward, she presented the bottom of the deed. I was not signing a temporary hold for a bondsman. I was signing away the equity, the title, and the legal ownership of the home my father built. I pressed the nib of the Montblanc to the paper. The friction of the metal gliding over the thick paper felt loud in the tense room. I signed my name once. I signed it twice. I initialed the bottom margin. A man stepped out of the shadows near my front door. Jessica had introduced him briefly as Greg, the notary from the agency. He wore a damp gray trench coat and carried a heavy leather satchel. He smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and wet asphalt. A legitimate state commission notary is required by law to verify the identity of the signer. They must ask for a driver license or a passport. They must record the document type and the identification serial number in a bound ledger. Greg asked for nothing. He did not look me in the eye. He simply walked to the kitchen island, pulled a heavy brass stamp from his satchel, and pressed it down onto the paper. The thud of the metal stamp hitting the granite counter sounded heavy. It was a cold, final sound. The ink dried. Jessica closed the blue folder, and in that precise moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The frantic, suffocating panic that had filled my foyer 10 minutes earlier simply evaporated. Barbara let go of my wrist. Her tears stopped flowing. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and smoothed the front of her coat. Jessica tucked the folder into her oversized tote bag and let out a long breath. It was not a shaky, terrified exhale. It was a clean, satisfied sigh. The kind of breath a person takes when a difficult, tedious chore is finally crossed off a list. "We will handle the rest at the courthouse," Jessica said. Her voice was steady now. The tremor was gone. "Try to get some sleep, Emily." They walked out the front door. The deadbolt clicked shut behind them. By 1:35 a.m., my driveway was empty. The house settled into a deep silence. I stood alone in the center of the kitchen. I turned on the kettle and made a cup of chamomile tea. I sat on a bar stool and stared at the empty space on the granite island where the blue folder had been. I felt a strange, hollow anxiety expanding in my chest. Something was wrong. I could not name it, but my subconscious was already analyzing the anomalies. The lack of identification requested by the notary, the sudden recovery of my weeping mother, the specific, calculated way Jessica shielded the top of the signature pages. I left the tea untouched on the counter. The water turned cold. When the sun came up the following morning, the emotional fog lifted. The data analyst inside my head clocked in for work. Data analysts do not sit idle with uncertainty. We hunt for variables. We isolate facts. I needed Jason's booking number. I needed to know which county judge was handling his arraignment so I could track the release of my collateral. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen felt like a tether to reality. The State Department of Corrections maintains a public portal. It is a live database that updates whenever an inmate is processed, fingerprinted, or transferred. I navigated to the county inmate roster. The search bar blinked steadily. I typed Jason Thomas Woods. I selected the parameters for the previous 24 hours. I hit enter. The system loaded. A small gray circle spun on the screen for 3 seconds. 0 results found. I frowned. Perhaps they misspelled his name during intake. I broadened the search parameters. I searched by his date of birth. I searched by his last name alone. I expanded the radius to include the 3 neighboring counties. 0 results found. There was no booking photo. There were no listed charges. There was no assigned bail amount. The database was entirely empty. I sat back in my desk chair. The quiet of the house suddenly felt heavy. Jason was not in the county lockup. He had not been arrested last night. He had not been arrested at all. There was no midnight transfer bus. There was no desperate need for temporary collateral. My eyes drifted to the window looking out over the front lawn of the property my father worked his entire life to secure. The cold dread crept up the back of my neck. If there was no bail bondsman waiting at the courthouse, then who exactly did I just give my signature to? In my line of work, a sudden absence of data is never a glitch. When a logistics tracking system goes dark, you do not assume the servers simply needed a rest. You assume a deliberate severance. You assume a breach. When a family manufactures a crisis, their subsequent silence functions the exact same way. It is the loudest alarm bell you will ever hear. For 3 consecutive days, my mother became a ghost. This was a woman who typically treated my phone as her personal diary. Barbara routinely sent a dozen messages a day detailing neighborhood disputes, weather complaints, and sales at the local department store. But on Wednesday morning, when I called to ask about Jason, the line rang exactly once before clicking over to the automated carrier voicemail. I did not leave a message. I hung up and opened my text thread with my brother. I typed a single sentence, "Are you safe?" I hit send. The delivery status updated immediately. I watched the screen, waiting for the 3 gray dots that indicate a reply is being drafted. Instead, a tiny timestamp appeared under my message. Read at 9:14 a.m. The 3 dots never materialized. He saw my question. He chose to let it sit in the void. They had extracted my signature in the dead of night, and now they were employing a tactical retreat. They were starving me of information, hoping I would simply write off the bizarre encounter as a resolved nightmare. Sitting at my desk, I decided to treat my family the way I treat a compromised supply chain. I started isolating the variables. If Jason was not in jail, then the premise of the midnight visit was a fabrication. If the premise was a fabrication, then the documents I signed were not for a bail bondsman. My mind snagged on the man in the trench coat. Greg. The silent man carrying the heavy brass stamp. The logical assumption was that Jessica had hired an actor. A friend or a cousin paid $50 to stand in my kitchen and play a convincing prop. If the notary was a fraud, then whatever paper they tricked me into signing would be legally void. I opened a new tab on my browser. The New Jersey Department of the Treasury maintains a public database of all commissioned public officers. I clicked through the portal, navigating to the notary search function. I closed my eyes and visualized the ink impression left on the paper. Gregory Thomas Linwood, commission expiring in 2 years. I typed the name into the search bar. My finger hovered over the mouse. I expected the system to return an error. I wanted the system to return an error. I clicked search. The page refreshed instantly. A green active status bar appeared next to a matching commission number. My breath caught in my throat. Greg was not a prop. He was a fully licensed, state-bonded notary public. He had broken protocol by failing to check my identification and failing to log the transaction in his journal, but his stamp held the full weight of the state government. This was a brilliant, terrifying red herring. I had spent hours hoping to invalidate a fake official, only to discover the far more dangerous truth. The notary was legitimate. The ink was binding. The weapon was not the man who stamped the paper. The weapon was the paper itself. By Thursday evening, the suspense became a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I needed visual confirmation of the lie. I grabbed my car keys and drove across town to the sprawling townhouse complex where Jason and Jessica lived. Their neighborhood was a maze of faux brick facades and manicured hedges funded by exorbitant homeowner association fees. Jason had a habit of pursuing the aesthetic of wealth without the foundation to support it. I parked my sedan down the street from their unit under the shadow of a dying elm tree. I turned off the engine and rolled down the window. The crisp November air bit at my cheeks. Jason parked his heavy-duty truck in the driveway. The pavement beneath it was dry. The engine block emitted no heat waves. He had been home for hours. I looked toward the front of their townhouse. The sheer linen curtains in the living room were drawn, but the interior lights were blazing. Shadows moved across the fabric. A flat-screen television flashed blue and silver light against the walls. A figure approached the window, holding a stemless glass. It was Jessica. She tilted her head back, taking a long sip of pale wine. A second shadow joined her. Jason. He wrapped an arm around her waist, and she leaned into his shoulder, shaking with silent laughter. There were no frantic phone calls to criminal defense attorneys. There were no tears. There was no desperate scramble to secure a release from county lockup. They were simply relaxing on a Thursday night. They were waiting for the ink to dry on whatever future they had just stolen from me. I sat in my cold car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The betrayal was no longer an abstract theory on a state website. It was a tangible, living thing unfolding 20 yards away. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving them to their celebration. The next morning, the quiet psychological warfare shifted into physical reality. I was standing at my kitchen island pouring a cup of coffee when the sound of heavy tires crunching over gravel broke the suburban silence. I walked to the front window and pulled back the blinds. A white Ford Transit van was backing into my driveway. The vehicle bore no company logos. The side panels were blank and dusted with road salt. Two men stepped out of the cab. They wore scuffed work boots, thick denim jackets, and utility belts weighed down with tape measures and laser levels. The passenger pulled a metal clipboard from the dashboard and gestured toward my roofline. I did not panic. I set my coffee mug on the counter, walked to the foyer, and opened the front door. The morning cold swept into the hallway. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice remained steady, level, revealing nothing. The lead contractor paused. He looked at me, then looked down at the paperwork clipped to his board. He removed his mirrored sunglasses, squinting at the house number bolted to the porch pillar. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said. He tapped a thick finger against a printed work order. "We are scheduled to pull the preliminary dimensions for a load-bearing wall removal." I crossed my arms over my chest. "I have not scheduled any renovations." The contractor frowned. He pulled a smartphone from his pocket and scrolled through an email thread. He looked back up at me, his expression shifting from polite confusion to professional annoyance. "We were not hired by the current tenant," he said slowly, enunciating the words as if I were failing to grasp a simple concept. "We were hired by the new property owners. We are supposed to measure the space for a full kitchen gut." The wind blew a dead leaf across the porch. The sound of it scraping against the wood felt impossibly loud. "The new property owners," I repeated. "Yes, ma'am." He turned his phone screen toward me just enough for me to see the bold text in the email subject line. He tapped the glass. "The clients assured us the property was vacant this morning." The word vacant hung in the frigid air between us. It was not a suggestion. It was a deadline. The family that stood weeping on my porch 3 days ago had already moved to the next phase of their schedule. They were not merely taking the deed. They were erasing my existence from the floor plan. After the white utility van backed out of my driveway, I did not scream. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. A loud reaction is a useless expenditure of energy. The contractors measuring my kitchen were merely symptoms of a larger hidden disease. If someone claims ownership of a physical asset, they must leave a paper trail. I am a data analyst. I hunt for breadcrumbs left in ledgers. I find the broken patterns. I walked out to the curb. My black metal mailbox stood on a wooden post near the street. I possess a rigorous habit regarding postal delivery. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, I retrieve, sort, and file my correspondence. Utility statements go in a blue folder, municipal notices go in a red one, junk mail goes straight into the recycling bin in the garage. But for the past 10 days, my sorting folders had remained bare. I had attributed the quiet to a holiday delay or a temporary postal route disruption. Now, looking at the empty metal cavern, I recognized the silence for what it truly was, a strategic blackout. I ran my fingers along the inside floor of the metal box. Dust and a single dead spider. Nothing else. I pushed the door shut. As the hinge swung upward, a flash of white caught my eye. A single envelope had slipped between the back seam of the metal housing and the wooden post, wedged tightly out of normal view. I pulled it free. The paper felt slightly warped from the morning dew. I looked at the return address printed in the upper left corner. It bore the blue umbrella logo of my homeowner insurance provider, the same company my father had used for 30 years to protect this property. I turned my attention to the plastic window in the center of the envelope. The recipient name should have read Emily Woods. It did not. The bold black ink spelled out something entirely different. J&J Holdings, LLC. J&J. Jason and Jessica. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a cold, metallic finality. My sister-in-law was not merely a crying wife standing on my porch, acting out a script of panic. She was the architect of the theft. Jessica worked as a senior loan processor at a regional mortgage firm. Her daily existence involved underwriting guidelines, title transfers, and escrow protocols. She navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of real estate law the way a veteran pilot flies through a storm. She knew exactly which forms required secondary verification and which ones relied solely on a blind notary stamp. To steal a house, you cannot simply record a fake deed. You must prevent the original owner from receiving the automated state notifications regarding the transfer. Jessica understood the vulnerability of the postal system. Anyone with a credit card and an internet connection can submit a change of address form online. She diverted my municipal mail to a private post office box, rendering me blind to the shifting reality of my own home. The wedged insurance envelope was a clerical error, a minor glitch in her otherwise flawless execution. I carried the damp envelope into my home office and sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. The time for speculation was over. I needed raw, unvarnished data. I brought up the search engine and typed the web address for the county property tax assessor. This portal is the definitive ledger for municipal real estate. It does not lie, it does not manipulate, it simply reflects the recorded truth. I navigated to the public search tab. The cursor blinked steadily in the property address field. I typed the house number. I typed the street name, Maple Drive. I clicked the gray search button. The web page buffered. A small blue circle spun in the center of the screen. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds felt like standing on the edge of a high cliff, waiting for a gust of wind to decide your fate. The page refreshed. A grid of property details populated the screen. Parcel identification number, lot dimensions, assessed tax value. My eyes bypassed the physical descriptors and locked onto the row labeled Current Owner of Record. The name Emily Woods was gone. In its place stood the cold corporate moniker, J&J Holdings, LLC. The recorded date of transfer matched the exact day following their midnight visit. I stared at the bright screen. My father had paid the mortgage on this structure for 25 years. He spent his weekends repairing the gutters, painting the trim, and planting the oak tree in the front yard. He handed me the keys with hands calloused by decades of labor. With one sleight of hand, a single signature, obtained under extreme emotional duress, my brother and his wife had erased all of it. They had converted a family legacy into a limited liability corporation. For 3 days, I lived in the house like a ghost haunting my own hallways. I did not confront them. I gathered my bank statements, I printed the county tax records. I compiled a timeline of events in a secure digital file. I knew that engaging them without legal counsel would only give them the opportunity to refine their lies. I waited. I watched the street. The wait ended on a Friday afternoon. A heavy knock echoed through the foyer. It was not the rhythmic, friendly tap of a neighbor dropping off a package. It was a firm, authoritative strike. I walked to the door and looked through the glass pane. A man in a dark windbreaker was walking quickly down my driveway toward an unmarked sedan. He did not look back. I opened the door. The crisp wind immediately caught the edge of a bright pink piece of paper taped at eye level to the wood. The color was unmistakable. It is the universal shade chosen by process servers and municipal courts to guarantee visibility. I peeled the tape away and held the paper in my hands. It was a formal legal document printed on heavy cardstock. The header read, 30-day notice to quit. It was a standard eviction notice in the state of New Jersey. The text outlined a demand to vacate the premises, remove all personal belongings, and surrender the keys. It cited termination of tenancy. The sheer audacity of the legal phrasing struck me. They were legally defining me as a tenant in the house I inherited. At the bottom of the page, the document listed the enforcing landlord. The plaintiff, demanding my removal from the property, was J&J Holdings, LLC. The breath left my lungs in one jagged exhale. The pink paper fluttered slightly in my trembling hands. This was the final step of their operation. They did not just want the equity. They did not just want the title. They wanted the physical structure. They wanted me out on the street. My brother was not facing a felony. He was facing a financial shortfall, and they had decided my home was the solution. The conflict was no longer a silent family dispute occurring behind drawn curtains and altered digital records. It had arrived at my front door. It was a formal declaration of war. And in war, you do not call the enemy to complain. You find them where they feel the safest. Telephone communication offers a convenient shield for a liar. It allows a deceiver to hold the device away from their ear to roll their eyes, or to simply terminate the connection when the questions become difficult to answer. I refused to grant my mother the luxury of distance. If she possessed the nerve to orchestrate the theft of my inherited home, she would have to look me in the eye while acknowledging the result. Every Tuesday at 10 in the morning, Barbara maintained a strict social ritual. She met two peers from her neighborhood garden club at a boutique bakery downtown. My mother structured her entire existence around public optics. She cultivated the persona of a selfless, devoted matriarch sacrificing for her children. During my youth, Jason played the role of the charismatic athlete who wrecked cars and required constant financial rescues. I played the role of the quiet student expected to manage my own problems without assistance. Barbara viewed my independence not as an achievement, but as a resource she could harvest to subsidize my brother. I parked my sedan down the street from the bakery. The brass bell above the heavy glass door chimed as I walked inside. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and warm butter. The dining area bustled with morning patrons. I scanned the room, isolating my target. Barbara sat in a curved leather booth near the front window. She wore a tailored beige sweater. A delicate pearl necklace rested against her collarbone. She was laughing. She held a small silver fork, picking careful pieces from a lemon scone. The weeping, breathless woman who had begged for my signature on my porch 2 weeks ago did not exist. That terrified version of my mother was a temporary ghost manufactured for a single midnight performance. I walked toward her booth. My footsteps made no sound on the polished concrete floor. One of her companions noticed my approach first. The woman paused mid-sentence, lowering her ceramic mug to the saucer. Barbara tracked her friend's gaze and turned her head. The human face contains dozens of individual muscles. A data analyst learns to read the involuntary twitches that betray internal panic before the brain can suppress them. When Barbara saw me standing there, the blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, ashen gray. Her effortless socialite smile collapsed into a tight, rigid line. The small silver fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against her porcelain plate. "Hello, Barbara," I said. My voice was flat and devoid of affection. I slid into the empty chair directly across from her. Her two friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to navigate the sudden tension. Barbara recovered her posture with practiced speed. She placed her hands in her lap, hiding her trembling fingers beneath the edge of the table. "Emily, dear," she said. Her tone was forced and artificially light. "We were not expecting you. Are you taking an early lunch break from the office?" I did not engage in the pleasantries. I reached inside my dark wool coat and retrieved the bright pink paper the process server had taped to my front door. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases against the edge of the table. I placed my palm flat against the document and pushed it across the smooth wooden surface. It stopped inches from her half-eaten pastry. "Explain this," I said. I kept my volume low. A whisper carries more threat than a shout. Her friends leaned forward, squinting at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. 30-day notice to quit. One of the women shifted uncomfortably in her seat and looked out the window. Barbara stared at the eviction notice. She did not feign ignorance. She did not act shocked or outraged on my behalf. The frantic panic from my front foyer was replaced by a chilling, calculated pragmatism. She leaned across the table, closing the physical distance between us so her peers could not hear her words. Her eyes narrowed into hard, dark slits. "Jason needs a fresh start, Emily," she whispered. Her breath smelled faintly of citrus and refined sugar. "He has obligations, debts he cannot simply walk away from without severe consequences." I watched her rationalize a crime with the ease of someone discussing a change in the weather. She was not denying the midnight ambush. She was attempting to reframe a felony as a necessary family sacrifice. "You are a single woman," she continued. Her voice dripped with practiced condescension. "You have a stable corporate job and a healthy savings account. You do not need a 4-bedroom house. It is a family property, and right now the family needs the equity more than you need the empty space. You can easily rent a nice apartment closer to your office." The psychological manipulation was seamless. She was shifting the burden of Jason's chronic failures onto my shoulders. She characterized my desire to keep my own home as an act of selfish greed. According to her twisted mathematics, my stability was the designated currency meant to purchase my brother's freedom. "Did Jessica tell you to say that?" I asked. "Or did you plan the municipal mail diversion together?" Barbara bristled at the accusation. Her jaw clenched tight. "We did what we had to do to protect him. He is your older brother. You should have offered to help him without making us resort to drastic measures. Bringing a fake emergency and a notary to my house in the middle of the night is not a drastic measure," I replied. "It is theft. You stole a deed." "Keep your voice down," Barbara hissed. She glanced nervously at the adjacent tables. "Do not create a scene in public." That was her singular vulnerability, the fragile illusion of her social standing. She was willing to render her own daughter homeless, but she was terrified of the local garden club discovering her methods. I looked at the two women sitting across from us. They were pretending to study their coffee cups, pretending they were not listening to the destruction of a family unit. I placed my index finger on the pink paper and slid it back across the wood. I folded it along the creases and returned it to my coat pocket. I had obtained the only piece of data that mattered from this encounter, a verbal confession. She knew exactly what she had done, and she felt zero remorse for the execution. I stood up. I looked down at the woman who raised me. I felt no lingering anger. Anger requires a persistent attachment. Anger requires hope that the other person might eventually realize their error and offer a genuine apology. I felt only a cold, sterile clarity. I no longer possessed a mother or a brother. I possessed opponents. "Enjoy your pastry, Barbara," I said. I turned my back and walked toward the exit. I did not look over my shoulder when the glass door chimed behind me. Stepping into the crisp afternoon air, I felt the parameters of the battlefield solidify. Opponents who rely on emotional manipulation will always crumble under the weight of superior data and ruthless legal mechanics. Barbara and Jessica believed the recorded quitclaim deed was an impenetrable shield. They believed the municipal court system would blindly process their paperwork and toss me onto the street before the end of the month. I walked to my sedan and unlocked the driver's side door. I needed someone who did not care about family dynamics or maternal tears. I needed a mercenary who understood the dark corners of real estate law. I picked up my phone and searched for the most aggressive property litigator in the county. I scrolled past the friendly mediators and the collaborative law firms. I searched for a man whose hourly rate reflected a habit of destroying fraudulent claims. I found a name. I dialed the number and started the engine. It was time to show my sister-in-law that a stolen piece of paper was only the beginning of a very expensive war. The architecture of a high-end law firm is designed to convey absolute authority and steep financial barriers. You do not walk into an office with mahogany wainscoting and original oil paintings to negotiate an amicable settlement. You walk in because you are preparing to sever an artery. At exactly 1 o'clock, I sat in a heavy leather wingback chair facing a sprawling desk. The nameplate read, David Sterling, Senior Partner. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a charcoal-tailored suit and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an owlish, predatory expression. Sterling built his reputation over 2 decades by dismantling fraudulent developers, dissolving hostile partnerships, and evicting squatters. He charged $700 an hour. He did not waste time with empathetic pleasantries. I handed him the pink eviction notice. Then I handed him the copy of the quitclaim deed I had printed from the county tax portal. Sterling placed the documents flat on his desk. He produced a silver letter opener tracing the lines of text with the pointed tip. He analyzed the pages with the detached precision of a surgeon reading an X-ray. The room remained perfectly quiet for 3 long minutes. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside his 12th floor window and the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He leaned back in his leather chair and removed his glasses. He pinched the bridge of his nose before looking directly into my eyes. "This is an exceptionally clean execution," he said. His voice carried the deep, resonant timbre of a man accustomed to speaking in courtrooms. I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, clean?" My mother physically grabbed my arm. "They lied about my brother sitting in a jail cell to induce a panic state." Sterling held up a hand to pause my defense. "Emily, the court does not care about the emotional temperature of your foyer at 1 in the morning. The court cares about the ink on this paper." He tapped the bottom right corner of the deed. "The notary stamp belongs to a commissioned state official," he explained. "Your signature is authentic. There is no evidence of physical coercion or forgery. In the state of New Jersey, absent a filed police report documenting an immediate threat of violence, this document indicates a voluntary transfer of assets. On paper, you gifted a $450,000 house to a limited liability corporation." I stared at the black ink. The sheer audacity of Jessica and her bureaucratic fluency made me feel sick. "If we fight the eviction," I asked, "what are our chances of convincing a judge that the signature was obtained under fraudulent pretenses?" Sterling sighed. "It would be a prolonged, expensive uphill battle. We would argue duress. They would argue you simply changed your mind and experienced buyer's remorse after completing a family transaction." He paused, letting the grim reality of the legal landscape settle over the room. "But defending the eviction is actually the least of your concerns right now." He opened a thick manila folder resting near his keyboard. He pulled out a dense stack of heavily redacted banking documents. He turned the stack around and pushed it across the desk toward me. "They are not planning to sell the property," he stated flatly. "A sale takes time. It involves public listings, appraisals, and waiting periods. Your sister-in-law needed liquid capital immediately." I looked down at the unfamiliar forms. The logo at the top belonged to Chase Bank. I recognized the layout of a standard loan origination packet, but the numbers printed in the bold columns made no sense. Sterling tapped a specific row on the second page. "I ran a comprehensive title history search 2 hours before you arrived," he said. "Yesterday morning, J&J Holdings secured a home equity line of credit against the appraised value of the property. The principal amount is $300,000. The air vanished from my lungs. A cold, creeping numbness spread down my arms. A HELOC is a revolving credit line tied directly to the equity of a home. When a homeowner borrows against that equity, the bank places a primary lien on the title. If the borrower defaults on the monthly payments, the bank possesses the legal right to foreclose on the property and seize the asset, regardless of who resides inside. Jessica used her position as a senior loan processor to push the application through the underwriting department at lightning speed. She knew the exact algorithms the bank utilized to verify income and assess risk. She bypassed the standard appraisal process, utilizing an automated desktop valuation. She fed my stolen deed into the banking system, and the system spat out a staggering amount of cash. They did not just take the physical structure of my house. They transformed the equity my father spent a lifetime building into their own personal ATM. They strapped a massive anchor of debt to the foundation and walked away with the capital. Even if I somehow convinced a judge to void the eviction and return the deed to my name, the property would remain saddled with a $300 lien I could never afford to satisfy. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to throw up. I closed my eyes, pressing my palms flat against my thighs to stop them from shaking. "How is that possible?" I whispered. "A bank does not distribute that kind of capital in 10 days without running a comprehensive background check on the newly formed LLC." Sterling offered a grim smile, the smile of a lawyer examining a beautiful, flawless crime. "Your sister-in-law is a licensed mortgage professional. She likely secured a bridge loan using an expedited commercial channel. She exploited professional courtesies and forged the required income verification. It is highly illegal, but highly effective." I opened my eyes and looked at the banking documents again. The scale of the theft was staggering. This was not a desperate scramble to pay a bail bondsman. This was a calculated, premeditated financial extraction. If they successfully pulled $300,000 out of the equity, I said, attempting to process the raw data. Why did they need it so desperately? Jason has a decent job. Jessica earns a solid salary. Why risk a felony conviction to steal from their own blood? What requires that much liquid cash in under 2 weeks? Sterling closed the manila folder and turned toward his laptop. He typed rapidly, a series of sharp, precise keystrokes. "People do not commit brazen, high-risk fraud to fund a vacation or remodel a kitchen," he murmured, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. "They commit this level of fraud because they are staring down the barrel of something much worse. If your brother needed $250,000 overnight, he was either paying off a very dangerous creditor or attempting to bury a radioactive secret." Sterling clicked his mouse, bringing up a private investigative database accessible only to law enforcement and licensed attorneys. "Let us find out exactly what kind of fire Jason is trying to extinguish," he said. I sat in the heavy leather chair watching the progress bar load across the monitor. The walls of the office felt closer now. The quiet family dispute over an eviction notice had just escalated into a massive financial crime. My brother and his wife had crossed a Rubicon, and the answer loading on the lawyer's screen was about to pull back the curtain on a secret they were willing to destroy my life to protect. 48 hours can feel like a brief exhale on a weekend or an agonizing eternity in a waiting room. For me, those 2 days stretched into a tight wire of psychological endurance. I paced the hardwood floors of my house, listening to the settling of the foundation. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a ticking clock. I was a data analyst, stripped of my raw materials, operating in a vacuum of information. I knew my family had stolen the deed. I knew they had extracted a staggering amount of capital from the equity. But the underlying equation still lacked the final variable, the motive. Thursday morning, the sky over New Jersey turned the color of bruised iron. A cold rain lashed against the living room windows. My cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed David Sterling. I answered on the first ring. "My investigator finished his preliminary audit," Sterling said. His voice was brisk, stripped of any conversational padding. "How quickly can you get to my office?" 20 minutes, I replied. When I walked into his mahogany suite, Sterling was not sitting behind his sprawling desk. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain blur the city skyline. A single manila folder rested on the polished wood. It was thinner than the previous file, but it carried a distinct gravity. "Take a seat, Emily," he instructed, turning away from the glass. I sank into the heavy leather chair. Sterling walked over and opened the folder. He did not pull out property deeds or municipal tax records. He produced a stack of printed corporate financial summaries and a printed email thread. "We assumed your brother was attempting to bury a radioactive secret," Sterling began. He steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the desk. "Our assumption was correct. The narrative they fed you on your porch was a calculated distortion of reality. The impending jail cell was real. The circumstances, however, were entirely fabricated." He slid the top document toward me. It bore the logo of Apex Freight, a mid-sized logistics and shipping company headquartered in Newark. Jason had worked there for 4 years as a regional operations director. It was a position that granted him sweeping authority over vendor approvals and independent contractor payouts. Jason always harbored an obsession with the tech industry. During family dinners, he frequently boasted about a software application he was developing, a platform designed to optimize long-haul trucking routes. He treated the venture like an impending gold mine, constantly assuring Barbara that he was one algorithmic breakthrough away from becoming a tech millionaire. But software development requires relentless capital. Coding engineers server space, and marketing campaigns burn through cash at an astonishing rate. "Your brother needed funding for his startup," Sterling explained. "When traditional venture capitalists rejected his pitch deck, he decided to source the capital himself. He utilized his position at Apex Freight to establish 3 phantom vendor accounts." I stared at the financial summaries. The spreadsheets displayed lists of authorized payments to independent trucking contractors who never existed. Jason had routed the funds through a series of anonymous shell companies. It was a classic embezzlement structure, simple, arrogant, and highly traceable to anyone looking closely. Over the course of 24 months, Jason siphoned regular, incremental payments. Sterling continued, his voice low and rhythmic. The total sum extracted from Apex Freight reached $280,000. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. $280,000. The number mirrored the frantic ransom demand my mother had sobbed about in my foyer. "Apex Freight initiated an internal forensic audit 3 weeks ago," Sterling said. "They identified the phantom vendors. They traced the routing numbers directly to your brother. The corporate executives confronted him on a Monday afternoon." "Why did they not involve the authorities immediately?" I asked. "A theft of that magnitude constitutes a severe corporate crime." "Because public scandals terrify corporate boards," Sterling replied. "An embezzlement case signals internal vulnerability to their shareholders." The executive board offered Jason a quiet ultimatum, a closed-door resolution. Sterling tapped a printed email correspondence. The text outlined a stark, non-negotiable demand from the Apex Legal Department. They gave him until the final day of November to provide full restitution, repay the stolen $280,000 in certified funds, or the corporate attorneys would hand the forensic audit directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jason was not facing a misunderstanding with a local bondsman. He was staring down the barrel of a federal wire fraud indictment. He was facing real, undeniable prison time. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, locking into place with a sickening clarity. The midnight visit was not a desperate plea for a temporary favor. It was a premeditated extraction mission. Barbara and Jessica knew the exact parameters of the corporate ultimatum. They knew Jason possessed 0 liquid assets because his app startup had already failed. They looked at the impending destruction of the golden child and decided that my inheritance was the designated insurance policy. They did not steal the house out of random greed. They stole the house to launder my brother's crimes. "Where are the funds from the home equity line of credit?" I asked. My throat felt incredibly dry. The words scraped against my vocal cords. "Gone," Sterling stated. He produced a wire transfer receipt from Chase Bank, the $300,000 credit line deposited into the J&J Holdings account on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, $280,000 was wired directly to the Apex Freight corporate restitution account. Your brother bought his freedom using the equity your father spent 3 decades building. I looked at the wire receipt. The sheer sociopathy required to execute this maneuver paralyzed me. My own mother looked me in the eye, held my wrist, and weaponized my empathy to save her son from the consequences of his own felonies. She traded my financial security to purchase his corporate silence. And the eviction notice, I whispered, staring at the dates on the paperwork. Why not just leave me in the house? Why throw me onto the street? If I continued paying the basic utility bills, I might never have discovered the title transfer until years later. Sterling leaned forward, his expression hardening into a look of grim professional respect for the enemy. Because a resident owner eventually receives municipal notices, a resident owner files insurance claims. If you stayed in the house, you remained a lingering vulnerability. Furthermore, they now possess a $300,000 lien requiring substantial monthly payments. They need the property vacant so they can rent it out to cover the debt they just created. You are not just a nuisance, Emily. You are the final loose end. The eviction notice was the broom designed to sweep the evidence out the back door. They needed me erased from the property to finalize the laundering cycle. I sat in the mahogany office, absorbing the profound depth of the betrayal. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. There was no family meeting that could repair this fracture. My blood relatives had coldly evaluated my worth and determined I was expendable. Sterling watched me process the data. We have the motive, he said quietly. We understand the mechanics of the theft. The next step involves determining our counteroffensive. Before I could form a response, a sharp buzz interrupted the silence. My cell phone vibrated against the hardwood of the desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a notification from a mutual friend. It was a forwarded image, a screenshot pulled from a social media platform. I reached for the phone and tapped the screen. While I was sitting in a law office discovering the vast federal crimes of my brother, Jessica was operating in a different reality. She was curating a digital illusion. The image on my screen showed a vibrant, sunlit patio at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, and the caption beneath the photo was about to push the conflict past the point of a quiet legal dispute. It was a public taunt, an arrogant victory lap demanding a response. The most dangerous criminals do not boast about their victories. They remain quiet. They fold their stolen assets into mundane offshore accounts and fade into the background. They understand that visibility is a liability. My brother and his wife did not understand this fundamental rule of survival. They were not hardened criminals. They were narcissists who possessed a lethal combination of bureaucratic fluency and insatiable ego. As I sat in David Sterling's mahogany office, staring at the glowing screen of my cell phone, the magnitude of their arrogance washed over me. The screenshot, forwarded by my mutual friend, was pulled directly from Jessica's Instagram feed. It was a masterclass in curated delusion. The photograph captured a pristine afternoon on a rooftop terrace in Manhattan. The Hudson River sparkled in the background, offering a cinematic backdrop of wealth and leisure. In the foreground, Jessica and Jason sat at a wrought iron table. They held tall flutes of expensive champagne, tilting the rims together in a celebratory clink. Jessica wore a designer silk blouse and oversized sunglasses. Jason wore a tailored linen jacket, projecting the relaxed confidence of a successful tech entrepreneur. The lighting was perfect. The filter was flawless. But it was the text positioned beneath the image that forced the air from my lungs. "Cheers to the launch of our new real estate investment portfolio," the caption read. "Sometimes you just have to bet on yourself. Hard work always pays off." She followed the sentiment with a string of aggressive hashtags: blessed, generational wealth, real estate empire. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The sheer, unadulterated gall of the post was breathtaking. It was a public humiliation, disguised as an entrepreneurial victory lap. While I was sitting in a law firm attempting to salvage the roof over my head, Jessica was utilizing my stolen inheritance to manufacture a digital brand. She was weaving a narrative of self-made triumph while actively processing my eviction. The generational wealth she hashtagged did not belong to her. It belonged to a man who spent 30 years waking up at 5 in the morning to pay a 30-year mortgage. A man who despised Jessica's superficiality and warned Jason repeatedly about living beyond his means. They were drinking champagne, purchased with the stolen equity of a dead man's labor. A primal, visceral anger surged in my chest. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard on the screen. The urge to react was a physical pressure demanding release. I wanted to tap the comment button. I wanted to type a single devastating paragraph exposing the raw truth. I wanted to tag the mutual friends, the country club acquaintances, and the Apex Freight corporate board. I wanted to burn their curated illusion to the ground, right there in the comments section, for all their peers to witness. The impulse to destroy their social standing was overwhelming. But I am a data analyst. I operate within a discipline that demands emotional suppression. An analyst understands that reacting to incomplete data only compromises the integrity of the final report. You do not show the enemy your weapon before you are standing on the battlefield. You do not interrupt an opponent when they are busy documenting their own hubris. I pulled my thumbs away from the keyboard. I took a deep, controlled breath, forcing the anger down into a cold, compressed space in my mind. I pressed the power button and the volume key simultaneously. The screen flashed, capturing the digital evidence. I opened my email application, attached the screenshot, and typed Sterling's email address in the recipient line. I added a timestamp and a brief subject heading. Social media documentation, J&J Holdings. I hit send. Sterling watched the process from behind his sprawling desk. He did not ask what I was doing. He simply waited for his computer monitor to chime, indicating the arrival of a new message. He clicked the icon, opened the attachment, and studied the image of the champagne glasses. He did not express shock or moral outrage. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound, grim satisfaction. Opponents who require constant public validation are the easiest targets to dismantle in a courtroom, he said quietly. They view a legal system the same way they view a social media feed. They believe optics can overpower facts. They believe a confident presentation can conceal a structural flaw. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his silver letter opener against his palm. This photograph is a strategic gift, Emily. She is publicly claiming ownership of the real estate investment portfolio. She is establishing a timeline of celebration that directly correlates with the approval of the fraudulent home equity line of credit. When the federal prosecutors review the file, this post will serve as Exhibit A, demonstrating premeditation and intent. I looked at the phone, resting on my knee. Let them enjoy the champagne, I thought. The bill was coming, and it carried a federal mandate. We need to prepare a defense against the eviction, Sterling continued, shifting the focus back to the immediate procedural threat. The municipal court will schedule a holdover hearing within 2 weeks. Jessica's attorney will present the recorded quitclaim deed and the notary stamp. If we enter that courtroom armed only with theories about corporate embezzlement, the judge will dismiss our claims as irrelevant to the property dispute. A landlord-tenant judge does not adjudicate wire fraud. They adjudicate titles. He locked his gaze onto mine. The owlish, predatory expression returned to his face. We must invalidate the physical paper, Emily. We need a structural defect in the deed itself, something the notary missed, something Jessica overlooked in her haste to secure the collateral. Think carefully. Is there anything unusual about the original title of the house? Did your father employ any unconventional estate planning measures before his death? The question hung in the quiet air of the mahogany office. My father. A sudden, vivid memory pierced through the haze of the legal strategy. It was a memory I had buried beneath layers of grief and mundane daily routines. 3 years ago, during the final week of his life, my father had summoned me to his hospital room. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, sterile frequency. He was a brilliant, paranoid man whose trust extended to a very small circle of individuals. That circle did not include his son, and it certainly did not include his son's wife. I closed my eyes, recalling the precise texture of the moment, the raspy sound of his breathing, the smell of antiseptic cleaner, the unexpected pressure of his frail hand pressing a cold, jagged object into my palm. I opened my eyes and looked at Sterling. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The answer was not hidden in a digital spreadsheet or a corporate ledger. The answer was sitting inside a reinforced steel vault, waiting for a specific brass key. The cardboard boxes sat stacked in the corner of my living room like a physical manifestation of defeat. I had purchased them from a local hardware store 3 days after receiving the eviction notice. They were flat, rigid, and waiting to be assembled. I refused to unfold them. Packing my belongings felt like signing a second surrender. I sat at my kitchen island, surrounded by the silence of a house that supposedly no longer belonged to me. The ambient glow of the pendant lights reflected off the polished granite counter. Resting in the center of that island was the vintage Mont Blanc pen. I stared at the black resin barrel. This was the instrument of my current destruction. The tool Jessica and Barbara had weaponized against me in the middle of the night. But it was also a gift from my father, a man who possessed a brilliant, cautious mind. He spent his career working as a risk actuary for a commercial insurance firm. He spent 40 hours a week evaluating structural liabilities, calculating the probability of failure, and designing policies to mitigate disaster. His entire professional existence revolved around anticipating the worst-case scenario and building a defense against it. He applied that exact same philosophy to his personal life. He trusted very few people. He loved his family, but he observed our dynamic with a cold, clinical accuracy. He recognized Barbara's blind devotion to her eldest son. He witnessed Jason borrow money he never repaid, launch ventures that consistently failed, and walk away from obligations without a backward glance. My father understood that Jason was a financial sinkhole. Looking at the gold trim on the cap of the pen, a specific memory pierced through the quiet room. It struck me, sharp and sudden, cutting through the residual fog of my current crisis. 3 autumns ago, the air in the oncology ward carried the distinct, sterile odor of iodine and bleached floor wax. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor provided a steady, mechanical soundtrack to my grief. My father lay in a narrow, adjustable bed. His physical frame had wasted away, but his mind remained incredibly sharp. It was the final week of his life. Earlier that afternoon, he had asked Barbara and Jason to visit the hospital cafeteria to secure a cup of coffee. It was a deliberate dismissal. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, he gestured for me to lean closer. I pulled a plastic chair to the edge of his mattress. His breathing was shallow. Each inhale required a visible exertion of effort. He slipped a frail, trembling hand beneath the edge of his thin mattress. When he withdrew his hand, he held his fingers in a tight fist. He reached across the white blanket and grabbed my wrist, turning my palm upward. He pressed a small, jagged object into my skin and folded my fingers over it. The metal felt cold against my palm. "Protect yourself, Em," he whispered. His voice was a raspy, strained rasp. I opened my hand slightly. A small brass key rested against my lifeline. The top of the key was stamped with a sequence of 3 numbers, 412. I did not understand. I assumed it belonged to an old filing cabinet or a forgotten toolbox in the garage. "What is this?" I asked. "Jason is going to drain this family dry," he said. His eyes locked onto mine, projecting a fierce, urgent clarity. "Your mother will let him do it. She will hand him the matches while he burns the house down. I have spent my entire life building a perimeter. I made sure he cannot touch your foundation." He gripped my wrist tighter. "Do not tell your mother about this key. Keep it hidden. When the storm hits, you will know where to go." The memory faded, leaving me sitting in my kitchen, breathing heavily. I had buried that interaction beneath the chaotic grief of his funeral and the subsequent years of navigating a demanding corporate career. I had filed the brass key away in a wooden keepsake box, assuming the word foundation was merely a poetic metaphor for my emotional resilience or my education. My father did not speak in metaphors. He was an actuary. He spoke in legal structures. He spoke in titles, deeds, and verified assets. Your foundation. He meant the literal, physical, concrete, and timber of the house I was currently sitting inside. He meant the legal bedrock of the property. I pushed my chair back from the island. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I walked rapidly down the hallway toward my bedroom. I opened the door of my closet and pulled down a small cedar chest from the highest shelf. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. I dug past old theater ticket stubs, a faded graduation tassel, and a handful of forgotten postcards. At the very bottom, resting on the smooth cedar wood, lay the small brass key. The numbers 412 glinted in the dim closet light. It was not a key for a padlock or a garage cabinet. The unique rectangular shape and the dual grooved edges were unmistakable. It was a secure access key utilized exclusively by financial institutions. The next morning, I did not log into my corporate workstation. I bypassed my daily routine entirely. I put on a tailored gray suit, the kind of armor required when navigating high-security environments. I placed the brass key inside the zippered pocket of my leather handbag. The drive to the downtown district took 30 minutes. The morning traffic crawled along the turnpike, but my pulse raced with a steady, frantic rhythm. The First National Bank occupied a towering granite building on the corner of the Financial Plaza. The architecture featured massive stone columns and vaulted ceilings designed to project an aura of impenetrable security. I walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby echoed with the hushed murmurs of tellers and the rhythmic stamping of deposit slips. I bypassed the main teller line and walked directly toward the rear of the lobby. A heavy steel gate separated the public area from the private subterranean levels. A polished mahogany desk sat outside the gate, manned by a vault manager wearing a dark, pristine suit. "May I assist you?" the manager asked. His tone was polite, but guarded. "I need to access a safe deposit box," I replied. I retrieved my state identification from my wallet and handed it across the desk. I pulled the brass key from my pocket and placed it gently on the wooden surface. The manager picked up the key, examining the stamped numbers. "Box 412, he confirmed. He turned to his computer terminal and typed my name into the security ledger. He studied the screen for a brief moment, checking the authorized access list. My father had handled the paperwork perfectly. My name was registered as the sole surviving authorized entrant. "Please follow me, Ms. Woods," he said. He stood up and pressed a security badge against a digital reader. The heavy steel gate unlocked with a loud, authoritative mechanical clank. I followed him down a short corridor illuminated by bright, sterile fluorescent lights. We arrived at a thick, circular vault door holding a complex series of locking bolts and time gears. The door was already propped open for daytime access. We stepped into the primary depository room. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with thousands of identical stainless steel rectangular doors. The air inside the room felt unnaturally cold and smelled faintly of oiled metal and old paper. The manager navigated the narrow aisles, reading the engraved numerical plates. He stopped in front of a section near the middle of the back wall. He located the metal door bearing the numbers 412. Safe deposit boxes require a dual locking mechanism to open. The bank holds a master guard key, and the client holds the unique individual key. The manager inserted his silver key into the primary slot and turned it to the right. The internal tumbler clicked. He stepped back, creating a professional physical distance. "Your turn," he murmured. I stepped forward. My hand trembled slightly as I guided the brass key into the secondary slot. I took a deep breath. I twisted the metal to the left. The final lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pulled the small metal handle outward. The steel door swung open on silent hinges. Inside the dark rectangular cavity, a long black metal container rested in the shadows. I reached inside, wrapping my fingers around the cold handle of the inner box. I pulled it free from the wall. The manager gestured toward a row of small enclosed privacy booths located just outside the main vault area. "You may use room 3 for your review," he said. I carried the heavy metal container down the hall. I stepped into the small, windowless room and shut the door. The latch engaged, securing me in absolute privacy. A single overhead light illuminated a simple wooden table. I placed the black box onto the surface. This was the defense perimeter my father had built. This was the contingency plan he designed to protect me from the greed of his own son. I rested my hands on the lid of the container. I lifted the metal clasp, pulling the top backward. The contents of the box were about to redefine the entire battlefield. The privacy booth in the subterranean level of the First National Bank felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. The small room contained no windows. No ambient noise from the bustling financial plaza above penetrated the thick concrete walls. The only auditory input was the faint hum of the air circulation vent and my own steady breathing. The harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent light reflected off the Formica table, illuminating the long black metal container resting in the center. The box looked like a miniature steel coffin. In a tangible way, it was. It held the remains of my father's final defense strategy. I unhooked the metal latch on the front of the container. The lid folded back on silent, well-oiled hinges. The interior smelled of aged parchment and the faint metallic tang of oxidized steel. Lying flat at the bottom was a thick manila envelope. It was not sealed with standard adhesive. A pool of dark red wax secured the flap, stamped with the imprint of a generic geometric seal. My father understood human nature. He knew adhesive could be steamed open, compromised, and resealed without leaving a physical trace. Wax shatters. It provides an immediate visual guarantee of integrity. He designed this failsafe to ensure I would be the first and only person to access the contents after his passing. I slid my thumbnail under the edge of the hardened wax. It fractured with a brittle snap, sending tiny red shards skittering across the table. I opened the flap and pulled out a dense stack of documents. The paper felt heavy and substantial premium bond stock, designed to survive decades in a vault. I separated the pages into two distinct piles. The first document was a warranty deed. I recognized the municipal formatting immediately. It was the original recorded master deed for the property on Maple Drive. But the grantee listed on the page was not Emily Woods. The name printed in bold black ink was The Woods Generation Skipping Irrevocable Trust. I turned my attention to the second stack of paper. It was a formidable legal instrument spanning 40 pages. The header was printed in a crisp, authoritative serif font, Declaration of Trust. I am a data analyst. I process dense information by scanning for structural anomalies, defining variables, and understanding the governing parameters. I began reading the clauses, translating the archaic legal terminology into operational reality. Standard estate planning usually involves a simple last will and testament, transferring assets directly to a designated heir upon death. A fee-simple absolute transfer. That is the exact assumption Jessica operated under. She assumed my father left the house to me outright. She assumed I held unilateral ownership. She assumed my signature alone possessed the power to surrender the equity to her newly formed limited liability corporation. My father knew better. He knew a direct transfer left me vulnerable to coercion, frivolous lawsuits, or calculated emotional manipulation. He chose an irrevocable trust. By legal definition, an irrevocable trust removes the physical asset from the taxable estate of the grantor and places it into an independent legal entity. The house did not belong to me. The house belonged to the trust itself. I flipped to page 14, navigating to the section outlining the trustee hierarchy. I located my name. I was designated as the primary beneficiary. I held the exclusive right to reside in the property, utilize its resources, and benefit from its shelter. I did not, however, hold the authority to dispose of it. I scanned the lines, searching for the governing authority. I found the designation listed in a subsequent paragraph. The managing trustee was an individual named Thomas Reed. Thomas was my father's old business partner, a retired commercial underwriter who viewed the world through the exact same cynical, analytical lens. Thomas was a man who demanded precision and despised shortcuts. He relocated to a quiet coastal town in Florida 5 years ago, but his fiduciary duty remained firmly anchored in New Jersey. My father selected him because Thomas was immune to Barbara's tears and Jason's fabricated emergencies. I traced my finger down to Article 7, subsection B, the restriction on the transfer of real property. The text was unequivocal. It explicitly stated that the title could not be conveyed, sold, encumbered, or transferred without the notarized signatures of both the primary beneficiary and the managing trustee acting in unanimous consent. I stopped reading. I sat perfectly still in the sterile banking booth. A slow, cold smile spread across my face, pulling at the corners of my mouth. It was not a smile of joy or relief. It was the grim, satisfied expression of a chess player who just watched their opponent confidently step onto a hidden landmine. The quitclaim deed Jessica shoved in my face at 1 a.m. was structurally worthless. I had signed a paper giving away an asset I did not legally control. In the eyes of the law, it was the equivalent of me signing a contract attempting to sell the Brooklyn Bridge. The document was entirely fictional. The subsequent transfer to J&J Holdings was a bureaucratic illusion built on a foundation of sand. I traced the grooves of my father's signature on the final page of the trust declaration. He had anticipated the siege. He had constructed a fortress around my inheritance, ensuring that even if I stumbled, even if my empathy was weaponized against me in the dead of night, the walls would hold. The foundation was secure. But the implications of this 40-page document extended far beyond securing my roof. The data cascaded through my mind, linking the variables together in a new, terrifying sequence. Jessica bypassed the municipal waiting periods and the standard title search using her professional credentials. She recorded a fraudulent deed to establish her corporate ownership. But she did not stop at municipal theft. She took that fictional deed and presented it to Chase Bank as legitimate collateral. She used a void title to extract a $300,000 home equity line of credit. She signed federal banking forms attesting, under penalty of perjury, that her limited liability corporation held free and clear ownership of the property. She authorized a wire transfer to cover her husband's corporate embezzlement, utilizing funds secured by a phantom asset. The conflict shifted on its axis. The battle was no longer a domestic dispute over a residential eviction. It was no longer a question of proving emotional duress in a county civil court. By defrauding a federally insured financial institution, Jessica had triggered a devastating chain reaction. Bank fraud is not a civil disagreement. It is a federal crime investigated by federal agents and prosecuted by the Department of Justice. The penalty for violating Title 18 of the United States Code is severe, unyielding, and carries a mandatory minimum sentence. I carefully stacked the heavy parchment, aligning the edges with precise, deliberate movements. I placed the documents back into the manila envelope. I did not need to scream at my mother in a coffee shop. I did not need to draft a hostile response to a smug social media post. I held the detonator to their entire fabricated existence. I placed the envelope into my leather handbag and zipped it shut. I carried the empty black metal box back to the vault manager and watched him secure it behind the heavy steel door. I walked out of the granite building and stepped into the crisp downtown air. The next step required returning to David Sterling's office. It was time to show my attorney that we no longer needed to play defense. We had the ammunition to level the entire playing field. I drove back to the commercial district with the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat of my sedan. It weighed only a few ounces, but it possessed the density of a neutron star. The fear that had gripped me since discovering the pink eviction notice was gone. In its place resided a profound, icy equilibrium. David Sterling did not typically accommodate unscheduled walk-in appointments. His daily calendar was orchestrated with military precision. However, when his receptionist notified him I was standing in the lobby, he permitted me to enter his mahogany suite immediately. He recognized the shift in my posture the moment I crossed the threshold. I did not speak. I unzipped my leather handbag, withdrew the heavy parchment documents, and placed them flat on the center of his desk. Sterling picked up the Declaration of Trust. He recognized the premium bond paper and the archaic, dense formatting of an older legal era. He leaned back in his leather chair, settling into his analytical rhythm. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of pages. He scanned the clauses, translating the legalese with the speed of a veteran litigator. He reached page 14. He paused. His eyes tracked across the paragraph detailing the trustee hierarchy. He read the stipulation requiring the unanimous, notarized consent of both the primary beneficiary and the managing trustee. He looked up from the page. He did not smile, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with sharp professional amusement. "Emily," he said softly, lowering the document to the desk, "the quitclaim deed they recorded with the county clerk is legally void. You did not possess the authority to surrender the title." He picked up his silver letter opener and tapped the edge of the parchment. "But a voided deed is not the masterpiece here," he continued. He opened the secondary folder on his desk and retrieved the Chase Bank paperwork. He placed the home equity line of credit origination packet directly next to my father's trust declaration. "Your sister-in-law bypassed standard title search protocols because she believed she held a flawless signature. She utilized her corporate credentials to expedite a commercial loan. She walked into a federally insured financial institution and presented a fictitious deed to secure a $300,000 credit line." Sterling leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. The gravity of his words anchored the room. "By executing that maneuver, your brother and sister-in-law did not simply commit a family betrayal. They committed federal mortgage fraud. The implications hit the quiet office like a structural shockwave. The parameters of the conflict had just expanded beyond anything my family could comprehend." Sterling tapped a specific line on the banking form. Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1344, Bank Fraud. The federal government does not view the deception of a financial institution as a simple civil dispute. It is a severe criminal offense investigated by federal agents and prosecuted by the Department of Justice. The statute carries a potential penalty of up to 30 years in federal prison. I looked at the two pieces of paper lying side by side. One represented my father's meticulous foresight. The other represented Jessica's lethal arrogance. From that precise moment, the narrative arc of my life fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the victim fighting an illegal eviction. I was no longer the discarded daughter scrambling to defend her childhood home from a corporate entity. I was the audience, sitting in the front row, watching a tragedy unfold on stage. Dramatic irony occurs when the spectator understands the impending doom, while the actors remain blissfully unbothered, continuing their performance, unaware of the trapdoor opening beneath their feet. Every smug text message Jason left unread, every condescending remark Barbara delivered over her pastry, and every arrogant social media post Jessica curated was now dripping with terminal irony. They believed they had executed the perfect crime. They assumed they had outsmarted a quiet data analyst using midnight theatrics and bureaucratic sleight of hand. They believed the money wired to Apex Freight had successfully purchased Jason's freedom and erased his embezzlement tracks forever. They had no idea they had just defrauded the federal government. And they had no idea I was currently holding the receipts. I drove home that afternoon and walked into my house. The cardboard boxes still sat in the corner of the living room, but they no longer represented defeat. They were simply discarded cardboard. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen island. I felt a deep, structural peace. The kind of peace that arrives when you realize the enemy has already engineered their own demise. Jessica navigated her corporate career with a sense of untouchable superiority. She believed her title processor credentials made her the smartest person in any room. She viewed me as an ignorant civilian, unable to comprehend the complex mechanisms of real estate finance. She assumed small-town people lacked the sophisticated knowledge required to challenge her paperwork. But she failed to calculate the true variables. She overlooked the meticulous paranoia of a risk actuary, and she underestimated the silent endurance of an analyst. For the next few days, I lived in the house without fear. The 30-day countdown on the eviction notice continued to tick away, but the threat was neutralized. I went to work. I bought groceries. I watched the autumn leaves fall from the oak tree in the front yard. I waited for the opposition to make their next move. The silence broke on a Wednesday morning, exactly 3 days before the Thanksgiving holiday. My cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen illuminated, displaying a text notification from Barbara. It was the first direct communication she had initiated since our confrontation at the boutique bakery. I did not open the message immediately. I let the digital notification sit on the locked screen, studying the preview text. Please come to dinner on Thursday. We want to keep things civil. Jason has a proposal for you. I read the words multiple times, dissecting the underlying strategy. The text was a carefully constructed trap. Thanksgiving is the ultimate American theater of forced unity. It is a holiday designed to weaponize guilt and demand compliance under the guise of gratitude. Barbara knew the eviction deadline was looming. She knew I had not vacated the premises. She needed to corner me in a room filled with extended relatives to exert maximum social pressure. The proposal she mentioned was an obvious tactic. Jason intended to offer a meager financial settlement, a calculated crumb tossed across the dining room table, designed to secure my quiet departure and prevent any further legal scrutiny into their newly formed limited liability corporation. They wanted to purchase my silence for a fraction of a percent of the equity they stole. They expected me to arrive at the dinner broken, desperate, and willing to accept whatever scraps they offered. They anticipated a rapid capitulation. I unlocked the phone and opened the message thread. I typed a single-word response. Okay. I hit send. I set the device down and walked to my closet to select my wardrobe. You do not wear casual attire when you are walking into a hostile negotiation. You wear armor. I pulled a tailored charcoal suit from the hanger. I was going to attend their holiday dinner. I was going to sit at their table, listen to their proposal, and look into the eyes of the family that tried to destroy me. I would let them spring their trap. I would let them execute their performance for the extended relatives. Because when you hold the detonator to a federal indictment, you do not need to raise your voice. You only need to wait for the perfect moment to press the button. Thanksgiving in the New Jersey suburbs carries a distinct, predictable rhythm. It involves crowded driveways, overflowing coat closets, and dining tables groaning under the weight of roasted poultry and generational resentment. I parked my sedan 2 blocks away from my mother's colonial home. The air outside was crisp, biting, and carried the faint scent of burning firewood from a nearby chimney. I did not dress for a festive family gathering. You do not wear a comfortable, oversized knit sweater when you are walking into an active ambush. I wore a structured, charcoal gray suit, tailored to project authority and unyielding boundaries. I locked my car and walked down the frost-covered sidewalk. My leather boots clicked a steady, even tempo against the pavement. The eviction deadline loomed exactly 3 days away. By Sunday evening, I was legally required by their fraudulent notice to surrender the keys to my childhood home. Barbara orchestrated this holiday dinner as the final pressure valve. She invited the extended relatives to serve as an unwitting audience, relying on the sheer weight of social decorum to force my capitulation. I pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the heavy wooden door. Barbara opened it a moment later. She wore a deep burgundy dress and a string of pearls. Her eyes darted over my charcoal suit, registering the visual disruption immediately. She expected a defeated daughter. She received a corporate adversary. "Come in, Emily," she said. Her tone was tight, a forced facsimile of maternal warmth. "Everyone is already in the living room." I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of cinnamon-baked apples and roasted turkey. It was an olfactory illusion of safety. I walked into the main living space. A fire crackled in the brick hearth. My Aunt Martha and Aunt Elaine sat on the floral sofa holding crystal goblets of white wine. When they saw me, their conversations halted. They stood up and approached me, offering tight, cautious hugs. "Oh, Emily," Martha murmured, patting my shoulder with deliberate slowness. "Transitions are so incredibly difficult. We are keeping you in our thoughts." Elaine offered a sorrowful, sympathetic nod. "Downsizing is the smart choice, dear. Maintaining a large property is a terrible burden when the finances become unmanageable. There is no shame in starting over in a smaller apartment." I observed their expressions, logging the data points. the pity in their eyes was genuine, because the narrative they received was a masterful fabrication. Barbara had seeded the ground long before I arrived. She painted a portrait of a struggling spinster daughter, drowning in unseen debts, unable to afford basic property taxes. She positioned Jason as the benevolent older brother who altruistically purchased the house to rescue me from foreclosure. The aunts believed I was attending this dinner to express gratitude for my brother's financial intervention. I did not correct them. Correcting unwitting pawns is a waste of strategic capital. I offered a polite, neutral smile and accepted a glass of water. Jason and Jessica arrived 20 minutes later. They swept through the front door carrying expensive bottles of wine and artisan desserts, projecting the aura of a highly successful power couple. Jason wore a tailored navy blazer. Jessica wore a sleek cashmere turtleneck, her hair styled in effortless waves. They greeted the aunts with boisterous enthusiasm, soaking up the admiration and the subtle praises regarding their newly established real estate portfolio. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with Barbara's finest china and silver cutlery. The seating arrangement was highly tactical. Barbara placed herself at the head of the table. Jason and Jessica sat together on the right flank. I was positioned directly across from them, isolated on the left flank, flanked only by empty space and a floral centerpiece. The meal progressed through a series of mundane topics: weather patterns, holiday shopping, traffic delays. Jason dominated the conversation. He spoke at length about fluctuating interest rates and the burdens of property management. He utilized industry buzzwords he clearly memorized from a podcast, attempting to sound like a seasoned developer. Jessica nodded along, playing the supportive, insightful spouse. She sipped a dark Pinot Noir, the crystal catching the light from the overhead chandelier. I ate my food in silence. I chewed. I swallowed. I watched the performance unfold. When the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, the ambient chatter faded. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted, growing dense and expectant. Barbara folded her napkin and rested her hands on the table. The signal was given. Jason cleared his throat. He shifted in his mahogany chair, squaring his shoulders toward me. He reached into the inner pocket of his navy blazer and withdrew a leather-bound checkbook. He placed it on the crisp white tablecloth. "M," he began. His voice adopted a low, resonant timbre, the practiced, patronizing tone of a senior executive addressing a struggling intern. "We know the upcoming transition is tough," he said, looking at me with manufactured sympathy. "Moving is a logistical nightmare, and the rental market is brutal right now. Jess and I were talking last night. We know you have to vacate the property by Sunday evening." The aunts leaned forward, watching the display of brotherly grace. "We want to help you get back on your feet," Jason continued. "We want to give you $5,000 to cover your moving expenses and your new security deposit." He unclipped a silver pen from his shirt pocket. He opened the leather ledger and wrote out the figures with slow, deliberate strokes. He tore the paper from the binding and slid it across the smooth surface of the table. The rectangular slip stopped inches from my coffee cup. "Because family looks out for family," Jason concluded. He offered a warm, magnanimous smile. I looked down at the paper. The logo in the upper left corner read, J&J Holdings, LLC. The check was drawn directly from the Chase bank account containing the stolen home equity line of credit. He was offering me a fraction of a percent of my own equity, utilizing funds secured through federal mortgage fraud to bribe me into a quiet exit. If I touched that check, if I endorsed it and deposited the funds into my personal account, their lawyer would argue I accepted a financial settlement. They would use the transaction to legally validate their ownership claim and terminate any future disputes regarding the title transfer. It was a calculated legal maneuver disguised as an act of charity. Jessica leaned back in her chair, resting her chin on her hand. Her lips curled into a smug, satisfied smirk. She waited for me to reach for the paper. She waited for the capitulation. I did not touch the check. I did not break eye contact with my brother. The silence in the dining room stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. The crackle of the fireplace in the adjacent room echoed through the archway. Aunt Martha shifted uncomfortably. Barbara narrowed her eyes, sensing a disruption in the choreography. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I stood up. My movements were smooth, unhurried, and precise. I buttoned the front of my charcoal blazer. I looked at Jason. The false sympathy on his face began to fracture, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. I shifted my gaze to Jessica. Her smirk faltered. "Keep it," I said. My voice was a quiet, steady current cutting through the warm air of the dining room. I did not yell. I did not cry. I let the unseen weight of the bank vault anchor my words. "You are going to need every single penny for your legal fees." I turned away from the table. I did not wait for a response. I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and out the front door. The deadbolt clicked shut behind me, severing the connection to the stunned, silent house. The cold November air hit my face, clearing the residual scent of roasted poultry and deception. I walked down the frost-covered sidewalk to my sedan. I started the engine and turned the heater on high. They believed they had executed a flawless ambush. They thought the Thanksgiving dinner would break my resolve and secure their stolen asset before the weekend expired. But Monday morning was rapidly approaching. The county courthouse would open its doors, the eviction deadline would officially expire, and the municipal filing would commence. They were preparing for a standard landlord-tenant dispute over a piece of paper. They had no idea my attorney was drafting an emergency injunction that would transform their simple real estate venture into a federal crime scene. The trap they set was empty. The real counterstrike was scheduled for Monday morning, and they were walking directly into the blast radius. Monday morning arrived with the sterile efficiency of a municipal clock. At precisely 9, the county clerk processed the electronic filing. J&J Holdings, LLC versus Emily Woods. The 30-day grace period dictated by their pink notice had officially expired. The legal machinery was now in motion, operating exactly as Jessica had planned. She expected me to file a standard response. She anticipated a desperate plea for an extension or a formal letter of surrender. David Sterling did not play the eviction game. Responding to a holdover complaint places the defendant in a subordinate position. It validates the premise that the plaintiff holds a legitimate right to demand vacancy. Sterling refused to grant them that baseline legitimacy. Instead, he utilized the state electronic portal to file an emergency quiet title action, requesting an immediate hearing directly before a superior court judge. A quiet title lawsuit is a specialized legal weapon. It bypasses the standard landlord-tenant docket and halts all eviction proceedings until the true ownership of a property is definitively established. It forces the opposing party to stand before a magistrate and prove their chain of custody under intense judicial scrutiny. At noon, a licensed process server walked up the paved driveway of Jason and Jessica's townhouse. He carried a dense stack of legal summons bound in a thick yellow folder. He knocked on the front door and handed the packet directly to my sister-in-law. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Within 30 minutes, my cell phone began to ring. I did not answer. I let the calls route directly to the digital answering service. Over the span of 2 hours, Barbara left 12 distinct voicemails. Listening to those audio recordings provided a fascinating study in psychological unraveling. A data analyst looks for patterns, and my mother's descent followed a predictable, rigid trajectory. The initial message featured loud, theatrical sobbing. She pleaded with me to withdraw the lawsuit, citing the severe stress it caused her blood pressure. She played the role of the wounded peacemaker, begging for family unity. By the 4th recording, the fabricated sorrow transitioned into frantic bargaining. She offered to increase the relocation stipend to $10,000. She promised to hire professional moving trucks and pay for my first 6 months of rent at a luxury apartment complex. The desperation in her tone was palpable. The quiet compliance she relied upon was suddenly replaced by a formal legal challenge, and she possessed no contingency plan for resistance. The 12th recording contained 0 tears. The maternal facade burned away, leaving only raw, jagged venom. Her voice hissed through the phone speaker, sharp and breathless. "You are tearing this family apart over a house you do not even need," she screamed. Her breath hitched, creating a distorted static crackle on the audio file. "Jason has a business to run. He is building a future. You are going to make him lose everything because you are too selfish to share." I sat on the floor of my father's study. I placed the phone on the wooden desk and let the audio play on the external speaker. The room smelled of aged paper, cedar wood, and dried tobacco. I felt zero anger. Anger requires a sense of betrayal, and I could no longer be betrayed by people I no longer recognized. I experienced only a profound, icy calm, the kind of tranquility that descends when the variables are locked and the final equation is waiting to be solved. I spent the afternoon packing my father's library into archival boxes. I was not packing to vacate the premises. I was packing to preserve his delicate actuarial volumes from the impending winter dust. I lifted a heavy leather-bound textbook regarding risk probability tables. He spent his entire life calculating vulnerabilities. He knew exactly how people behaved when pushed into a corner. He knew panic bred arrogance, and arrogance bred fatal mistakes. Jessica proved his theory correct before the courthouse closed. She did not retreat. Retreat requires self-awareness and an admission of vulnerability. Instead, she doubled down. She hired a local civil litigator who specialized in rapid residential evictions. At 4 p.m, her attorney filed a swift countermotion. They petitioned the judge to dismiss the quiet title action, characterizing it as a frivolous delay tactic orchestrated by a disgruntled former tenant. They formally accused me of legal harassment. Attached to their counterfiling as Exhibit A was a high-resolution digital scan of the quitclaim deed. Jessica treated that piece of paper like an impenetrable mythological shield. She believed the dark conditions of its creation would remain buried in my kitchen. She assumed the midnight ambush, the manufactured tears, and the silent notary would never face cross-examination. She possessed a supreme, dangerous confidence that the bright fluorescent light of a courtroom would somehow magically validate the ink. Their confidence was their greatest liability. Because they had successfully manipulated me in the dark, they believed they could manipulate a superior court judge in the light. They prepared their defense for a minor civil dispute. They compiled utility bills, printed property tax records, and organized their LLC registration paperwork. They were treating the impending hearing like a routine administrative hurdle. They remained utterly blind to the reality of their situation. They did not know that David Sterling possessed a copy of an irrevocable trust. They did not know we held the corporate emails detailing Jason's embezzlement. And most importantly, they did not comprehend that their $300,000 Chase Bank credit line was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in a public forum. I sealed the final cardboard box of books and pushed it against the wall. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the front lawn. The weekend passed in a state of suspended animation. The neighborhood remained quiet, oblivious to the legal warfare brewing behind my front door. Monday evening, I laid out my wardrobe for the following morning. I polished my shoes. I gathered the manila envelope containing the wax-sealed documents. My brother and his wife believed they were walking into a mundane municipal hearing to enforce a legal eviction. They thought they were holding the winning hand in a high-stakes game of real estate poker. They did not realize the legal track had shifted beneath their feet. They had laid a path paved with fraud, deception, and federal violations. And on Tuesday morning, the heavy oak doors of the courthouse would open to welcome them directly into the ambush. Tuesday morning brought a relentless, driving rain that turned the New Jersey skyline into a smeared canvas of slate and charcoal. I parked my sedan in the municipal garage adjacent to the county courthouse. The concrete structure echoed with the sound of tires splashing through standing water and the distant wail of sirens. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. Today was the culmination of weeks spent gathering data, analyzing variables, and organizing a flawless counter-narrative. I walked across the wet pavement toward the imposing granite facade of the judicial building. The architecture was designed to intimidate. High, arched windows flanked heavy oak doors, projecting an aura of uncompromising authority. Inside, the lobby smelled of damp wool coats, wet leather shoes, and industrial floor wax. A line of disgruntled citizens shuffled through the metal detectors. I placed my handbag onto the conveyor belt and walked through the scanner. I found David Sterling waiting for me near the elevators. He wore a pristine black suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He offered a curt, professional nod. We rode the elevator in silence, ascending to the third floor civil division. The corridor outside courtroom 304 bustled with chaotic energy. Frazzled public defenders conferred with nervous clients. Frustrated landlords clutched folders full of unpaid invoices. Through the milling crowd, I spotted my opposition. Jason stood near a wooden bench leaning against the plaster wall. He wore a crisp navy suit paired with a light blue tie, projecting the polished aesthetic of a respectable property developer. He was playing a role he had rehearsed in his mind for years. He chatted quietly with a man holding a thick legal pad. Jessica sat on the bench beside him. Her posture was rigidly perfect. Resting on her lap was the familiar blue cardboard folder, the exact same folder she had pulled from her tote bag during the midnight ambush. Seeing it again triggered a brief phantom chill along my spine, but the sensation vanished instantly, replaced by analytical focus. 2 rows behind them, Barbara occupied a seat near the back of the gallery. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at the corners of her eyes. She was already performing her heartbroken matriarch routine for an audience consisting of bored clerks and weary bailiffs. She wanted anyone watching to believe she was a tragic figure caught in the crossfire of her children. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. The bailiff instructed the gallery to enter and find their seats. The interior of the room featured high vaulted ceilings and rows of polished mahogany benches. The judge sat elevated behind a massive wooden bench, looking down upon the plaintiff and defendant tables. Sterling and I took our designated places on the left side of the aisle. Jason, Jessica, and their attorney settled at the table on the right. The morning docket moved with brutal efficiency. The judge, a stern veteran magistrate named Davis, dispatched the preliminary disputes with rapid-fire rulings. He possessed zero tolerance for theatrics or prolonged emotional testimony. He demanded raw facts and verified documentation. At 10:15, the clerk called our file. J&J Holdings, LLC versus Emily Woods. The opposing counsel stood up immediately. He was a slick, fast-talking civil litigator, accustomed to bulldozing unrepresented tenants in rapid eviction mills. He buttoned his suit jacket and strode confidently toward the center podium. "Good morning, Your Honor," the attorney began. His voice projected a smooth, practiced certainty. "We are before you today to resolve a simple holdover eviction matter. My clients are the legal owners of the residential property located on Maple Drive. The defendant currently occupies the premises without a valid lease agreement and has formally refused to vacate despite being served a proper 30-day notice." Judge Davis peered over the rim of his reading glasses. He sifted through the preliminary filings on his desk. He located the plaintiff's submission and frowned slightly. The defendant was the prior owner of record, the judge noted. Did a formal sale occur? "No, Your Honor," the attorney replied without missing a beat. "The defendant legally transferred the property to my clients via a quitclaim transaction. It was a voluntary intra-family conveyance. I have the original recorded document right here." The lawyer retrieved the blue folder from Jessica. He pulled out the single sheet of paper bearing my signature and the heavy brass notary stamp. He handed it to the bailiff, who relayed it up to the elevated bench. I sat perfectly still. I kept my hands folded flat on the wooden table in front of me. I felt a subtle movement to my right. Jason shifted in his chair, turning his head slightly to look at me. Our eyes met across the aisle. He offered a small, patronizing smile. It was a facial expression containing a lifetime of unearned entitlement. He believed he had won. He believed his tailored Navy suit and his hired lawyer had successfully legitimized his theft. He was waiting for me to lower my head in defeat. I did not break eye contact. My expression remained a blank, unreadable slate. Judge Davis inspected the paper for a long, quiet minute. The rhythmic tapping of the court reporter typing on the stenography machine filled the silence. The magistrate lowered the document and shifted his gaze directly toward my table. "Ms. Woods," the judge stated, his voice carrying a heavy judicial weight, "your signature appears at the bottom of this conveyance. Do you contest the authenticity of your handwriting on this document?" The trap was officially sprung. This was the moment Jason and Jessica had anticipated since the midnight ambush. David Sterling rose from his chair. His movements were slow, deliberate, and saturated with command. He did not rush to the podium. He stood tall beside our table, smoothing the front of his jacket. "We do not contest the physical authenticity of the signature, Your Honor," Sterling said calmly. "The ink belongs to my client." A quiet, victorious exhale escaped Jessica's lips. I heard the sound drift across the aisle. Her lawyer smirked, assuming the defense had just folded its hand. However, Sterling continued raising his volume, just enough to slice through the opposing counsel's premature satisfaction. "We argue the signature was obtained under severe emotional duress in the middle of the night based upon fraudulent pretenses." The opposing attorney scoffed, leaning heavily against the wooden podium. "Your Honor, claims of familial duress are entirely subjective and irrelevant to the recorded title. Buyer remorse does not invalidate a notarized, state-recognized deed." Sterling ignored the interruption entirely. He kept his eyes locked on the magistrate. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the circumstances surrounding the physical signature are secondary to the primary structural defect Sterling declared. We formally contest that the defendant possessed the legal capacity to convey the title in any manner whatsoever." Judge Davis raised an eyebrow. The boredom vanished from his features, replaced by sharp judicial curiosity. "Explain yourself, counsel." Sterling unclasped the brass locks on his leather briefcase. He reached inside and withdrew the thick manila envelope. He extracted the heavy premium parchment pages. "The residential property located on Maple Drive does not belong to Emily Woods," Sterling announced, his voice echoing off the high plaster walls. "The property is exclusively owned by the Woods Generation Skipping Irrevocable Trust." He walked forward and handed the dense 40-page document to the bailiff. "My client is designated strictly as the primary beneficiary of that trust," Sterling explained, returning to our table. "She is not the managing trustee. The trust declaration explicitly prohibits the transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property without the verified, notarized consent of the designated managing trustee, a man named Thomas Reed. Mr. Reed is currently residing in Florida and possesses zero knowledge of this alleged transaction." The courtroom atmosphere shifted drastically. The oxygen seemed to evaporate from the plaintiff table. Therefore, Sterling concluded, delivering the final devastating blow. "The quitclaim deed presented by the plaintiffs today is structurally void. It is a legally fictitious document. You cannot grant an eviction based on a forged chain of custody." Judge Davis flipped through the heavy parchment pages. He scanned the trustee hierarchy clause. He traced the specific restrictions regarding property transfer. The magistrate possessed decades of experience in real estate law. He recognized an impenetrable legal fortress the moment he saw one. In order to enter this new evidence into the formal court record, Sterling noted, "We have prepared a sworn submission affidavit attesting to the origin of the trust document." Sterling slid a crisp white sheet of paper across our table, positioning it directly in front of me. He placed his index finger next to the blank signature line. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. I pulled out the vintage Mont Blanc pen. The smooth black resin felt warm against my skin. The gold band caught the harsh overhead fluorescent lighting. This was the exact instrument Jessica had forced me to use during her midnight heist. She used it to build a trap. I was now using it to lock the cage around her. I uncapped the pen. I pressed the nib against the pristine paper. The sharp scratching sound of the ink flowing onto the page seemed to amplify in the stunned silence of the room. I signed my name with slow, precise, elegant strokes, ensuring every letter was perfectly legible. The scratching of the pen ceased. I placed the gold cap back onto the black resin barrel and rested my hands on the table. The submission affidavit now bore my verified signature, linking the original irrevocable trust directly to the formal court record. The bailiff stepped forward, retrieved the crisp white paper, and delivered it to the elevated bench. Judge Davis adjusted his reading glasses. He aligned the affidavit next to the dense 40-page trust declaration. He read the text. The interior of the courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a structural collapse. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead ventilation system and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock above the jury box. The opposing counsel, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, abandoned his confident posture at the podium. He walked briskly back to the plaintiff table and leaned over Jessica's shoulder. He stared at the duplicate copy of the trust document Sterling had provided for opposing review. The lawyer scanned the paragraphs detailing the primary beneficiary limitations and the managing trustee requirements. I watched the blood drain from the attorney's face. His complexion shifted from a flush of arrogant certainty to a pale, sickly gray. He was a man who built his career on rapid civil filings. He realized in a fraction of a second that his clients had handed him a fabricated instrument. He had unwittingly presented a fraudulent claim to a superior court magistrate, exposing himself to severe professional sanctions. He stepped away from Jessica, treating her as if she were suddenly radioactive. He gathered his legal pads and took 2 distinct steps away from their chairs, severing his association with their sinking ship. But invalidating the eviction was only the preliminary objective. David Sterling did not bring us to the courthouse merely to win a civil dispute. He brought us here to execute a decisive final maneuver. Sterling turned his attention back to the judge. The magistrate was already shaking his head, preparing to dismiss the holdover complaint. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sterling interjected, his voice ringing clear and authoritative across the silent room, "the plaintiffs did not merely record this fictitious deed to pursue an illegal eviction. They utilized the fraudulent title to execute a secondary operation." Sterling reached into his leather briefcase one final time. He withdrew the heavily redacted banking records we had acquired through the private investigation. He handed the stack of financial documents to the bailiff. 2 weeks ago, Sterling stated the plaintiffs approached Chase Bank. Jessica Woods utilized her professional credentials as a licensed senior loan processor to bypass standard underwriting protocols. She presented the void quitclaim deed to a federally insured financial institution, attesting under penalty of perjury that her limited liability corporation held free and clear ownership of the property. She used a phantom asset to secure a $300,000 commercial line of credit. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, dense with the gravity of the accusation. "The funds were dispersed immediately," Sterling continued. "We possess the wire transfer receipts demonstrating the capital was subsequently routed to a corporate entity to cover prior illicit debts incurred by Jason Woods. By executing this sequence of transactions, the plaintiffs committed a textbook violation of Title 18, United States Code Section 1344, bank fraud." The phrase hung in the air, a cold, sterile classification of their arrogance. I turned my head slightly to observe my family. I wanted to see the exact moment the illusion fractured. Jason's reaction was not a slow, creeping realization. It was a sudden, physical collapse. The invisible string holding his posture upright simply snapped. His shoulders slumped forward. His chin dropped toward his chest. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the wooden table, slipped off the edge and dangled at his sides. The tailored Navy suit no longer projected the aura of a successful developer. It looked like a costume draped over a hollow frame. He understood the severity of the federal code. He knew his attempt to bury his corporate embezzlement had just spawned a far more devastating criminal exposure. Jessica sat frozen. The smug, patronizing smirk she had worn since the Thanksgiving dinner shattered. Her eyes widened into circles of unfiltered, open-mouthed terror. She stared at the back of her retreating lawyer. She was a professional who understood the banking industry. She knew federal investigators did not negotiate. She knew they possessed the authority to audit her employer, freeze her accounts, and revoke her license permanently. The career she idolized, the freedom she took for granted, and the pristine social media facade she curated were disintegrating in real time. She reached out and grabbed Jason's forearm. Her manicured fingers dug into the fabric of his sleeve, seeking an anchor that no longer existed. Jason did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Davis lowered the banking documents. His expression hardened into concrete. The standard judicial neutrality vanished, replaced by a fierce, rigid intolerance for the deception enacted within his jurisdiction. "Counsel," the judge barked, his voice cracking like a whip. He directed his gaze at the retreating opposing attorney. The lawyer raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "Your Honor, I had zero prior knowledge regarding the financial maneuvers of these individuals. I was retained strictly for a residential holdover matter. I am pausing this eviction proceeding immediately," Judge Davis declared. "The civil complaint is dismissed with prejudice." The magistrate gathered the trust declaration, the void quitclaim deed, and the Chase Bank wire receipts. He tapped the edges of the paper against his desk, aligning them into a neat stack. "However, this matter is no longer contained within the purview of the civil docket," the judge continued. "I am impounding these exhibits. The court clerk will forward the entire unredacted file directly to the District Attorney White Collar Division and the federal regulatory agencies for immediate criminal review." A sound erupted from the back of the gallery. It was not a rehearsed theatrical sob. It was a raw, jagged, piercing scream. Barbara stood up from her wooden bench. She clutched the back of the pew in front of her. Her knuckles were stark white. The reality of the situation had finally breached her psychological defenses. She watched the magistrate hand the evidence of her son's federal crimes to the court clerk. The golden child she had protected, enabled, and subsidized for 3 decades was now destined for a federal indictment. The grief in her voice was genuine, unpolished, and harrowing. It was the sound of a mother recognizing her own complicity in the destruction of her family. The bailiff moved swiftly down the aisle, gesturing for Barbara to sit down and maintain order. The courtroom descended into a chaotic murmur of hushed whispers and shuffling papers. I did not turn around to watch my mother unravel. I did not look across the aisle to witness the ruins of my brother and his wife. I felt no desire to gloat or bask in their humiliation. The data was processed. The equation was balanced. I picked up my leather handbag. I nodded to David Sterling, acknowledging his flawless execution. I stood up from the defendant table, turned my back on the courtroom, and walked up the center aisle. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the corridor. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and exited the granite building. The rain was still falling. It washed over the pavement, clean, cold, and relentless. I walked to my sedan and drove home. The legal machinery grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly fine. 3 months later, the inevitable consequences materialized. The federal authorities do not rush their investigations. They build airtight, structural cases. The Department of Justice formally indicted Jason and Jessica Woods on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy. The regional mortgage firm terminated Jessica's employment instantly upon receiving the federal subpoena. The court froze their financial assets, including the remaining balance in the LLC accounts. The townhouse they lived in was listed for short sale to cover their mounting legal retainers. The polished, curated Instagram feed went dark. The social media illusion evaporated, leaving only the harsh reality of their impending trial. Barbara stopped attending her Tuesday morning coffee meetings. The local garden club thrives on pristine reputations, and a federal indictment is an unforgivable social blemish. She retreated into her colonial home, isolating herself from the community she once sought to impress. She never called my phone again. The house on Maple Drive remained safely secured within the impenetrable walls of the Generation Skipping Irrevocable Trust. Thomas Reed, the managing trustee in Florida, sent a brief, formal letter confirming the structural integrity of the asset. It is a quiet Tuesday morning in early March. I am sitting at the granite kitchen island. The vintage Mont Blanc pen rests in a small wooden tray near my laptop. I hold a warm ceramic mug of chamomile tea, letting the steam rise against my face. The locks on the front doors have been changed. The security codes have been updated. The lingering traces of the midnight ambush have been scrubbed from the foyer. I look around the empty space of the kitchen and listen to the ambient hum of the refrigerator. Silence is a fascinating variable. When a family manufactures a crisis, they use silence as a weapon. They use it to isolate, to confuse, and to punish. They weaponize the quiet to starve you of data. But when the conflict ends and the threat is neutralized, the nature of the silence changes. It is no longer a tactical maneuver designed to inflict anxiety. It is simply the absence of noise. It is the sound of a secure perimeter. It is the sound of a foundation that held firm against the storm. I take a sip of my tea. The house is quiet, and the quiet is just peace. In the American cultural consciousness, the concept of the family home occupies a sacred, almost mythological space. It is idealized as the ultimate sanctuary, the place where height marks are etched into wooden door frames, where Thanksgiving tables groan under the weight of tradition, and where the values of the next generation are quietly forged in the spaces between daily routines. We are taught that the family structure is a fortress, meant to protect us from the harsh realities of the outside world. But what happens when the architects of that home, the parents themselves, build the foundation on fundamentally unequal ground? When we step back from the shock of a midnight ambush, a forged quitclaim deed, and the sprawling shadow of federal bank fraud, the story of My Stolen Inheritance ceases to be a mere legal thriller. At its core, it is a devastating generational autopsy of failed parenting. It is a cautionary tale about what occurs when the fundamental duties of raising children, instilling honesty, enforcing fairness, and practicing emotional awareness are abandoned in favor of preserving a hollow, curated illusion of success. To understand how a brother could look his sister in the eye and casually offer a $5,000 bribe to steal her rightful property, we must look at the environment that manufactured his entitlement. Jason did not become a corporate embezzler and a familial predator overnight. He was carefully, methodically molded into one by a mother who believed that protecting her child meant shielding him from the consequences of his own actions. This is the toxic underbelly of the golden child dynamic, a tragic phenomenon entirely too common in affluent suburban neighborhoods. Barbara loved her son, but her love was entirely devoid of emotional awareness or moral boundaries. Whenever Jason stumbled, whenever he accumulated debts or failed in his ventures, Barbara did not allow him to feel the sting of his failures. Instead, she rushed in with a safety net, smoothing over the cracks, paying off the creditors, and projecting a flawless image to her garden club peers. In doing so, she committed the ultimate parental failure. She taught him that accountability is an inconvenience reserved for other people. She taught him that his desires were paramount, and that any mess he created could simply be swept away by someone else. When parents fail to guide their children through small, manageable failures in their youth, they inadvertently guarantee that those children will face catastrophic, unmanageable failures in their adulthood. Jason's federal indictment was not a sudden anomaly. It was the inevitable destination of a road Barbara had been paving for him his entire life. Conversely, we must examine the silent, heavy burden placed upon the good child. In families lacking fairness, the independent, responsible child is rarely celebrated for their self-sufficiency. Rather, they are viewed as a utility. Because I did not demand financial rescues, because I built a stable career as an analyst and managed my own life, my stability was commodified. Barbara looked at my emotional strength and my financial security not with maternal pride, but as a harvestable resource meant to subsidize Jason's recklessness. When a parent demands that one child sacrifice their well-being to cover the sins of another, they are not asking for family loyalty. They are demanding a hostage. Emotional awareness in parenting requires the ability to look at each child with objective clarity, offering unconditional love without offering unconditional immunity. A healthy traditional family structure relies on the absolute bedrock of fairness. If honesty is replaced by the desperate need to keep the peace, the family does not find peace. It simply delays a massive structural collapse.
Yet within this tragedy, there is also a profound lesson regarding the enduring power of responsible, forward-thinking guidance. My father did not leave behind a legacy of blind, naive trust. He was a man who understood the bitter realities of human nature, even within his own home. He recognized his wife's blind spots and his son's destructive trajectory. True parenting does not end when a child turns 18, nor does it end when a parent passes away. My father's final act was a masterclass in protective love. He did not simply hand me the keys to a house and hope for the best. He handed me a vintage Montblanc pen and taught me the rigorous logic of reading the fine print. He gave me a brass key to a hidden vault, and he established a generation-skipping, irrevocable trust. He understood that hoping your children never face a severe storm is a fool's errand. The duty of a parent is to give them the blueprints, the materials, and the legal structures to build a shelter that cannot be blown away. He left me a foundation that held firm against the ultimate betrayal, because he loved me enough to tell me the hard, uncomfortable truth about the people sitting at our own dinner table. These quiet, devastating dynamics play out in countless homes across the country, hidden behind drawn curtains, manicured lawns, and perfectly curated social media feeds. The pressure to project a flawless family unit often traps victims in a cycle of silent endurance, convinced that setting a boundary is an act of betrayal. If you have ever been the child expected to quietly carry the weight of a family's secrets, or if you have ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line to protect your own hard-earned foundation, you are not alone. These are the complex, deeply human narratives we dissect and bring to the light. I invite you to drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with setting boundaries, and please subscribe and follow Aura Vengeance. Together, we will continue to explore the stories where quiet observation outmaneuvers loud manipulation, and where earned justice always finds a way to balance the scales. As I sit at the granite island in the home my father built, listening to the peaceful, unbroken silence of a secure perimeter, I am left with a lingering, complicated thought. Parents do not merely leave behind physical assets, bank accounts, or real estate. They leave behind the moral framework their children must eventually live within. They hand us a set of keys. Some of those keys open doors to wisdom, resilience, and profound strength. But some of those keys unlock dark, inherited rooms of entitlement and deceit. Ultimately, the true test of adulthood is sitting in the quiet aftermath of a family storm, looking at the heavy ring of keys you have been handed, and deciding for yourself which doors you will walk through, which doors you will lock forever, and which locks you simply have to change to finally find your peace.